Corner brace, 2-inch. You're bad. Now you got me giggling. Yeah, I can't think.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
What was you gonna say?
Shut up.
You need filing?
Well, the last video I did on the faux French-inspired cast iron planner seemed to go over really well with folks, and there were 2 more designs that I had saved in images that I was interested in. So I may do 2 more, but right now I am going to do 1 more, which means it requires you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It usually does.
So, I'll show you the picture and we'll get started. Okay, this is my box. Interestingly enough, when I saved all these pictures, look at that price, Randy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's a real 19th century Jardiniere.
Well, you're building a 21st century.
Yeah. Copycat. The nice thing about this is it did give the measurements here, but it's a little big in my estimation. What I have done is I have copied their widths down, and they gave centimeters, which actually is easier to do mathematically to figure it out. The side is basically 8/10 smaller, or 8/10 of the front width here, and the height is 9/10 of the side, 8/10 of the long end. So figuring that out, I first decided what I wanted my width to be. Their width was 18. I'm gonna go with 15. And 8/10 of 15 is 12. So the side will be 12. And then 9/10 of this side depth is about 11. So that's what we're going to do. 11 high, 15 wide, 12 deep. Don't need any mitered corners because, as you can see, molds are going to be on the edges. So no budded wood would show.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the feet. Again, I'm going to need to use the epoxy sculpt, at least in this little section that I do, for strength. but I also want the metal corner brackets. At first I thought, well, I'll just do it flat to the ground. And then I started looking at this again, and I went back to what my mama said. If you're gonna copy something, pay attention to details and copy it. So, I'll show you my prototype over here at your table. I have taken the corner bracket and I have used a hacksaw and I cut one. Now I tried to leave a tiny bit, well, a little bit more than that actually, of the flat, because I thought, well, even though I'll put clay on it, I didn't want it to be super sharp, you know, when somebody sets it on top of something. But anyway, so I need the other three cut like this, and obviously there is a left and a right, so they'll have to angle in opposite directions. Now when I did this, I wrapped it in blue tape and then drew my line, because you taught me before that, you know, like for the saw blade to grab.
It helps.
Yeah.
Keep you on course.
Exactly. Even though it cut through it, you know, in just a couple of passes, it still got me started. So if you do that, I'm gonna be working on this, because before we put the box together, you see these lines? And then even on the side, see the lines? They're indentations.
It's like a grid.
It almost looks like tiles, but it's not. But the other weird thing is it doesn't go all the way. I have zoomed this in just to see, like, there's no indentation here or here. It's just that little bitty bit. And it looks like, okay, it's divided in thirds this way and it's divided in thirds this way, except the top 2/3 don't show. However, on this end, the middle third, you do see the lines. You don't see the top ones. Another weird thing I noticed, and maybe this is because of welding, but these things don't line up. And this top doesn't line up. I don't like that. I want mine to line up. Do you think that's because of the way it was put together? The way they welded it or something?
Or it was intentional.
Well, do you think it looks better with that being a little higher? Or would it look better being even?
What'd your mom say?
She would say copy the picture.
Exactly. You just have to figure out what the difference is.
Well, it isn't much.
Because, maybe an eighth.
If you did, well, then an eighth might look like it was a mistake.
Or a quarter.
I don't know about that. Okay, anyway.
Couldn't you make the difference up in the mold? If you wanted it to offset?
Well, yes. But you can tell from here to here and from here to here, those don't line up. I don't know. It just... And all the other iron things I've seen, they do line up on the sides.
I just think it may be the way the angle of the picture, because this side does line up. This one doesn't. See what I mean?
No.
It's not much of a difference here.
I don't know what you mean. Where are you pointing at? You're talking about this piece? That's just the molding.
I'm talking about this piece. And this piece. This is up just a tad higher.
Oh, and you're saying that like this, it looks like they're the same height. Well, maybe. I just think we need to do it the same height. Anyway, so the first thing is cutting these things, and I'll mark them for you. Well, I messed up.
I'm listening.
These lines aren't supposed to be here. I knew something looked off. They're supposed to be in the center, like you do when you're laying tile, staggering it.
Well,
I have to fix it.
not a problem.
But this has got to be filled.
Uh-huh.
And I need it to be smooth, not rough, because I'm not going to be putting a whole bunch of texture on this one, on the outside.
Right. I got you, Lamsey.
What are you going to use?
Wood putty.
Is it smooth?
It will be after it's sanded.
It's not grainy like that other stuff you've used before?
It's no more grainy than the wood. It'll be just as smooth as the wood.
Okay. But I can't fix it now?
No. Not till I get the bottom in.
Okay. Well, let's do that. So you've cut the bottom.
Yes, I have. Make sure it's going in the correct way. It should be. It's square. Okay.
So what do? Just set that down in there and let it dry overnight?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I didn't watch you make the last one.
Yeah, this stuff right here is really good.
Oh yeah, TITEBOND. You just turn that over where the glue's on the bottom of the table.
Yeah.
So now we just leave it?
No, not yet. And now, since I got it in there, I got to set the corners up so the glue don't dry to the base. Then I glue it from the inside corners.
I guess I'll see what you mean.
Into the corners. And now I'll run the glue around the inside corners, just like caulking, but it's glue. And that way it's guaranteed to hold. And gravity pulls it down in the slight crack. Not much of a crack there.
Well, that looks off anyway. Looks like I went up too far. I did.
What do you mean you went up too far?
I was supposed to stop right there. I did it again.
Well, you measured it.
I know.
Measure it, mark it, and I'll fill the tops in.
I could do it like this. Good grief. Now I have to do the other side. See, you're supposed to be in thirds.
Okay.
My next step is to add some trim pieces to the outside of the box to support the epoxy sculpt material that I will be using for the trim. Now, I had already measured the length of what these trim pieces should be to extend beyond the box. I had decided 1 7/8 based on mathematically that's what it came out to. However, when I cut the first piece and laid it on there, I felt like it looked a little too long. My husband always says, make it pleasing to the eye. This wasn't pleasing to me. It looked a little bit too long. So instead of 1 7/8, I recut it to have an extension of just 1 3/4. It will end up being a little longer anyway because it will have to completely be wrapped in the epoxy sculpt material. I'm using some basswood here, some basswood strips, just like I did on the first box. These are 1/4 inch thick and 1/2 inch wide. I did end up running out of it, and so Randy cut me some strips of the 1/4 inch birch. No, take that back. It was sanded plywood. We ran out of birch, so for this box we used 1/4 inch sanded plywood. But he cut me some strips, and also I had to piece some of them together, but that's okay because I just needed the thickness there because it's going to entirely be covered by the epoxy sculpt material. For the long front and side ends of the box, I'm using the 1/2 inch wide strips at the top, at the bottom, and at the sides. But when we get to the depth of the box, the shorter depth, it changes a little bit. So I'll talk about that when we get to it. are addressing the sides of the box, and again I'm using the 1/2 inch width at the top and the bottom. But on the side edges, I am using 1/4 inch thick by 1/4 inch wide. And the reason is, well, let's look at the picture again. Let's zoom in a little bit on this picture. You can see here that there isn't a full wide piece of trim on that edge. It is actually the back side of the front piece of trim. Now, I could have just not put any trim there at all, but I was afraid it would look too thin from the side edge, so I want to use a little bit of the mold again. I'll use the smaller of the two wood trim molds in the Faux Bois mold and put that on the back side of the trim piece to make it look like it is the back side of the front wood trim piece, if that makes any sense. My next task is to figure out the measurement of the height of that little topper piece. I had already figured out the width. It's easy to do. You just divide your space, your box there, into equal measurements. So for the width, it was an 1/8 plus a 32nd. Well, that's 5 32nds. The total width of my box is 15 inches, so you multiply 5 32nds times 15, and I rounded up to 2.4 inches. Now I'm doing the same thing, dividing the box the other direction to find the height of this little weird looking little piece. I'm not sure what it is. It doesn't really have a defined design to it. But anyway, to determine the height, you just do the same thing. Divide the box, add the fractions together that represent that section of the box, and then multiply. After you add your fractions, you're going to multiply it times the height, which in this case is 11 inches, and I get my height. Now I have an overall height, and then I have just the part that sticks up above the box. Now I know that I'm going to have to use the epoxy sculpt for these pieces. I used them in the first planner box and explained in detail about that product and why it's necessary to use that, but basically it's because it dries super hard, and you need something that's going to be strong and not pliable and not break. Anything can break, but this stuff is really hard to break. So I know I'm going to have to use the epoxy sculpt. Well, looking at the picture again, all 4 of these weird looking toppers are exactly the same. In other words, they're not reversed like on a left and a right. They all go in the same direction. So I decided what's going to be the easiest thing to do, especially since I have to use the epoxy sculpt. And I thought I need to make me a mold. In that way, if I have a mold, all 4 of them will look exactly alike. So my first step here is to sketch it out, and my mom always taught me to, when you're drawing, to grid something out. I did not grid it. I just kind of looked at it and said, okay, well, this little curvy section looks to be like half or a fourth of the space and sketched it out. And then I will use the epoxy sculpt to sculpt me this weird looking little topper. I will let my casting get hard, and after it does, then I'll be able to make my mold. Well, I've had to move out here to Randy's shed. It's just too difficult for me to film out here and make sure the whole box is in the frame. Well, pause. That made no sense. What I meant to say was it's too difficult to film in the basement and get this whole large box in my camera screen. So that's why I'm moving out to Randy's shed. Now, I did this yesterday. It is hard as a rock. You probably noticed that I didn't put any glue down. That's because the epoxy sculpt will bond to just about anything. Now, I'm going to be using the epoxy sculpt and the Faux Bois mold for all of the wood trim along all the edges. But before I move on, I need to do the back side of these and the top side, and then I will do the bottom exactly the same and flip it over and do the other side. But I'm going to turn this over. Make sure I'm in frame so you can see what I'm doing. To finish the top edge of the box, I'm using the smaller of the two tree bark molds in the Faux Bois mold. But it's a little bit narrower than I needed it to be to bridge the gap between that front piece of trim and to completely come to the back edge. So first I'm putting on some clay just really thinly to help bridge that gap. Then I add the mold and continue to sculpt it, eliminate the leaf design each time in the molds. I didn't want the leaves. I just want it to look like a tree limb or tree bark. So I just smush it down here and there in places where it's a little too thick on the top, and then use my tool to smooth it and to add some additional lines like you would see in tree bark. For the bottom trim piece, I am adding some of the epoxy sculpt clay material to the top side of the strip of basswood first, and then applying the casting. That again is to bridge the gap of the missing thickness there, because my casting is wider than the basswood, and also I didn't want any gaps between the casting and the box. I wanted it to look full along that whole edge. So adding that clay piece helped. Now when I got to this end, I thought, why am I making separate pieces? I'm just going to fold this long strip of casting underneath that edge. I'm having to use my tool anyway to finish out that pointed corner. So I just wrapped it underneath and then formed my slanted edge. Thinking through the steps as I go, I realized I needed to address the feet next. I needed to build some support using the epoxy sculpt material around the corner brackets to get my width and a little bit of thickness. Plus, I needed to carve out a little section of the casting on the bottom there. Let's look at the picture again, and I'll show you why. You can see in the picture that the way that leg works, the side trim on the front of the box and the back of the box comes down and overlaps that bottom piece. Well, if I hadn't trimmed some of that away on the bottom casting, there would have been a hump there, and I want it to look smooth like it does in the picture. So that's what I'm doing here, is just getting my base ready for that side piece of trim. This is Amazing Mold Putty. It's made by Alumilite, the same company that makes the resin that I use. This is also in a 2-part container. You can see I've used some. Getting it out may be fun. I think I'm going to end up needing the whole thing. These containers might be good for something. Save them. Much easier to work with because it is a putty. I did spray this with Rustoleum Clear Matte Sealer. Just because I wanted to kind of ensure that it's not going to stick to the putty. It probably wouldn't have anyway, but better safe than sorry. So you mix this until it's all one color. Kind of have to work pretty quickly on this. I actually wish I had a little bit more of this because I'd like to make the mold a little thicker. But we'll just have to do with what we have. All right, we have about 2 minutes to work here. Need to really press down in to get all of the indentations of the mold. I'm actually going to flip it over. And press it this way too. Come through the other side. We're just going to let this sit. It'll take about 20 minutes for this to turn into a harder rubber type surface. I'm really tired of my bumbling self right now. I'm wondering how many of you have caught my mistake, my big blunder. I didn't catch it until yesterday when I was editing my video. Take a look at the picture. Does my box match it? The answer is no. You see the mistake? These are slanted the wrong way. They're supposed to go the opposite way. It has to be fixed. Luckily, it's fixable. And the epoxy sculpt material is extremely hard. I mean, honestly, I didn't even really need the wood pieces that came out. I used them for just extra support to keep the epoxy clay straight while I was molding it until it dried. This is so hard. The only thing I can do is saw it. But I need them to line up too. So, to determine where I need to cut, I'm gonna put this right here. I'm lining it up with the bottom and making a mark. Do that on all four. I think I'm gonna try this small one before I go to the big hacksaw. Fixing mistakes. It's funny how the voice of your elders comes back to you. I would say to haunt you, but it's really not a haunt. It's just doing the right thing. When I was a young girl, probably between the ages of about 7 to about 13, when I was a teen, every summer I would spend a week with my maternal grandparents who lived about 2.5 hours away from us. And my sweet little grandmother, she taught me the beginning of teaching me how to sew. My mom is an excellent seamstress, so she continued to teach me. But my grandma really was the first one that said, I think it's time for her to learn. And I was only like 7 or 8. I remember what it was. I made an orange colored vest. Real simple vest. Hey, it was the 70s. So, no. What am I saying? It was the 60s. I was born in the 60s. I was born in 60. Anyway, first thing I'd ever made was this orange vest. And I was sewing the side seam and I made a glitch in my seam. My grandma looked at it and said, well, honey, you're going to have to rip that out and redo it. And I said, why? Because it had been really hard for me to sew. And she said, well, first off, you won't ever be happy with it because when we press the seam open, it's not going to press open flat. You're going to have a little pucker there. And it'll pucker from the outside. She said, you'll never be happy with it. So you need to fix it. You need to take the time to fix it. And I was apparently annoyed because I'd already had to rip out seams, and that's not easy to do. And she looked at me and she very quietly said, if you don't take the time right now to fix it, when are you going to make the time later on to fix it? I've never forgotten that. So, when you have a mess up like I've got, stop and fix it. Or you won't be happy with it. sorry for the barking dog in the background. When my husband weed eats, one of our dogs barks. And the other one's here, hiding under the table. Anyway, I wanted to take a minute to tell you where we're at with all of this. I have one last thing to do before I can take it finally back down to my craft room in the basement to the fun part. I knew that I was going to run out of the epoxy sculpt, so I had ordered some more. Only I ordered the 1 pound container. I was trying to be cheap, I guess, because it was, you know, cheaper than the 4 pound. But the 4 pound is much more economical. So if you're ever going to get this product, I would suggest you go ahead and spring for the 4 pound containers. But even if you're going to wait to use it for a little bit, I would open the containers and put some saran wrap or press and seal down on the product. Maybe spritz some water, then put the press and seal down and close the container. Because the drying out is what makes it so hard to work with. The new stuff I got was a little bit easier, but not a lot. So when I got the 1 pound package, I focused on what I knew I had to use it on, which were these toppers. Hopefully you noticed when I applied them, I did mention that I waited about 2 hours, leaving them to dry flat to kind of get to the point where they weren't going to fall over. Well, even after the 2 hours when I started applying, you may have seen that one starting to fall over. I put some clay behind it to help support it, but I also took some popsicle sticks and broke them and taped one end to the top edge and slanted the other one to where it would be touching the back of the toppers here to support it while it completely dried. They are completely dried. As I said, I did run out of the second batch of epoxy sculpt. So in order to finish the trim, I needed to use a clay that was sculptable. I love the Hardy Soft Clay, and as I said in the last video on the planter, I use it like 99% of the time, which is absolutely true. But the Hardy Soft Clay is not very sculptable. It has such elasticity to it that it wants to bounce back, and it doesn't smooth out very well with water. So I had to use an air dry clay that would be comparable to the epoxy sculpt. I used the DOS brand. I prefer IODs, but I didn't have any, so DOS is what it was. So after supporting the back here with some DOS clay, because I'd already run out of the other, I let all that dry. Now, you might be able to tell a difference. There are some whiter looking areas here, like around the edges and things. Also, I believe it's this side. Yeah, this is much whiter. This is the DOS. This is the epoxy sculpt. But I had some gaps here and there in the epoxy sculpt on the edges. I did not like that. I am not going to be using a lot of texture on this, the outside of this container, because it's, well, in the pictures it just doesn't call for it. I will use some, but nothing like I did on the first round. So I used the DOS clay again to fill in some areas. The last thing that I need to do on this, which probably would have been easier to do before I applied these, but nevertheless, I need to put some more trim on the back side of these legs. So to do that, I think these are all the same height. Carefully going to set this here to support it. I don't want anything to touch my toppers. Yes, they're strong, but anything can break. So I'm raising this up to finish up these tops. I want to completely cover the back side here along with the brackets. so that I have a finished looking bottom. The sides of the box are exactly like the front and the back, with the exception of the ivy leaves toward the top left and right. And then obviously the design is a little more condensed, a little tighter in, because the sides are 3 inches shorter than the front and the back. This has been a long build. I surely appreciate you watching. And by the way, for those that don't know, I always list the products that I use in the description box below each video. So if you click on that little more button under the video, you will see the list. The part 2 video that goes with this Jardiniere will be half the length of this one, and it will be addressing the finishes on the box, to include that special rust that I like to use, a couple of different rusts, and some similar paint techniques to the previous box. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. This planter will actually be for sale. The last one my mama grabbed up really quickly before I even put it in my Etsy store. If you're interested in that, the Etsy link also is always in the description box below the videos. So if you made it this far, thanks again so much for watching. Be sure to catch part 2 to see the final finish on this French Jardiniere.